everyone. As mentioned, my name's Alex Lawrence. I'm the managing editor at 6GWorld. This is a small but growing media outlet. We're looking at essentially what comes in the next generation of telecoms and how we get there from today in a way that makes it as sane as possible to do. So not just the technology, but looking at how we combine that with regulation, policy, the commercial and operational elements, to make sure that whatever it is that comes out in the next generation of telco is relevant for the environment that it comes to light in. So if that sounds of interest to you, we do news, videos, webinars, research papers and events. So please do drop by 6gworld.com. And if you like what you see, then sign up to the newsletter every 2 weeks. And we'll look forward to having you there. So essentially, when it comes to MWC, I'm looking at it through maybe a slightly odd lens, and perhaps that's why I'm here. I'm not a specialist in MVNOs particularly, but I've got a very broad remit and looking not necessarily at what goes on at MWC through the lens of what's happening this year, but how do we move forward from there through the long term, and what are those implications? So I've put together a slide based upon my own experiences at the event, and it's more of a word cloud. I would love to have had something a lot more structured for you, but I think what we found is that there are several very strong themes that all interrelate to each other. So this just seemed like a better way to phrase it. So we've got essentially 4 key overarching concepts here in bold, plenty of other ones, of course, and then the purple one down the bottom, resilience and what it means, actually wasn't at MWC specifically, but raised its head at the same time. And I think it's worth talking to if we're looking at this long-term future. So without having any particular order to go at these in, I'm going to start talking, and hopefully by the time that we finished, it'll have helped give you some context. So just to start off with the commercial versus technical, for no particular reason, telecoms operator groups normally make a big song and dance about the technology that they have. And last year, for example, if you went around the large telco operators, they were all presenting use cases of 5G plus AI or 5G plus robotics, and trying to do demos and make things very tangible. This year, I think we moved away from that, and instead these organizations were talking about capabilities, whether that's delivering enterprise services, using open gateway capabilities, delivering new kinds of AI in their network to create services. But essentially, they're not talking about their networks at all as the main thing. They're not showing off technology. It's about what can you do with it to make money from it. So cynically, that might be considered to be a retreat away from, if you like, the old heartlands of telecoms. But I think actually this kind of change in approach reflects a lot more pragmatism. And this kind of ties in with the next thing around the circle here. It's not what you've got, it's how you use it. And this is essentially the idea of leveraging existing assets in new ways to do more and to generate returns. While we do have sort of all kinds of new technology and new ideas being shown at the event, I think it's very striking that we've got a lot more ideas bubbling under the surface as well. For example, different telcos looking to create network effects by collaborating internationally, for example, so that an enterprise that's a multinational can work with um, a telco and actually get the same experience and the same services across all of their locations, and breaking out of that kind of national isolation that comes along with being a national telco with usually a different set of elements within your network compared to other places. So I think that's kind of an exciting piece. Um, there was talk about using networks as sensors. So, for example, this is talking about, let's say, using your fiber network in different ways. So, being able to analyze slight perturbations um, in how the light's traveling through them to identify if, for example, vehicle traffic is running over the top of where the cables are buried, or for example, if it's running under a train line, maybe you can start to identify where the rails are um, in danger of breaking, that kind of thing. And similarly in the sort of radio side of things, understanding better how you can use the attenuation information to understand whether there's the air quality around you or what the weather's doing, and so be able to for example sell that to companies that need this kind of information to understand in granular detail what particular microclimates are like around the country, that kind of thing. The I'm sure everybody heard about the Open Gateway and Camara elements, and here again it's really about trying to use the information that's native to networks in a different way. I mean, that has quite a lot of implications of its own, but this is essentially it, isn't it? Sort of location, payment, identity, all really significant. There were some quite interesting demos looking at, for example, taking different access technologies as well, which may well be relevant from the sort of MVNO side, particularly if you're looking at enterprise and indoor concepts. So this was looking, for example, at aggregating signals between different access technologies, in particular in the uplink, which can be more challenging. So in one particular instance, it was combining Wi-Fi, Li-Fi, and 5G signals so that you're able to build up in real time a 3D rendered model of what's going on around you. So there are occasions where that's going to be useful, but no individual one of today's services would be able to do that. So again, using what you've already got in a slightly smarter way. And of course, private 5G is something that we've got to talk about in this context, because while there's a good chance that it's not going to be led by the major telcos, and there's definitely scope for MVNO and MVNE activity here, there is more appetite, it seems, to be using their spectrum assets to support companies that are working in these areas. And in part, this may be a case of the telcos getting ahead of regulation that would open up more access to spectrum, for example. But in the meantime, potentially there's a role for them as an enabler and a partner in a way which we haven't seen before. I think that's potentially quite exciting. And linked to that is this idea of the three evolutionary concepts. So we've got some very different views of where the telecoms industry as a whole is headed or should be headed, depending upon where you're coming from. If you're talking from a government perspective, then they are very keen on bringing the telecom sphere into um, to support greater socioeconomic goals. So they'll be talking about sustainability, closing digital divides, improved security for the nation, and that kind of thing. We can come back to this, but that's starting to work its way through. For example, in finance, where, for example, Telefonica has taken out $3 billion worth of green bonds, and if they don't reach a certain level of sustainability, then they're going to have to pay a higher interest rate on those. And this whole topic area I will come back to, because I think there's some interesting opportunities here. The other concepts of where things are going from many of the vendors and researchers there is kind of what we'd expect. It's what we see today, but turned up to 11. Whatever's coming next is going to be new spectrum. It's going to be faster. There's going to be more capacity and all this kind of good stuff that means vendors are going to vend. But there was some real pushback from a lot of the sort of major operator community, and particularly as voiced by the NGMN. And they are wanting minimal investments in infrastructure and spectrum for whatever's coming next. They want to be able to use what they have better, and they want to develop new capabilities. But ideally, in a perfect world, that would be just in software. And again, I come back to Kamara and the Open Gateway, because I think that's an example of something there. The other thing which I think is striking is this idea of a better mousetrap. So what we saw in terms of many of technologies and things is developments all across the board. So if you look at devices, there were AR and VR glasses and so on that are closer to being usable real-life glasses, AI pins like a portable Alexa. We saw improvements in AI, particularly related to things like large language models and interactivity. But mostly the purposes that they were being used for are essentially what we already do today, but a bit better or with fewer people involved. And that's normally phase one of adopting new technologies, of course. But I think it was a bit disappointing that there hasn't been so much sight on radical disruption when we get to understand better what these technologies can do to really change the way that we're doing things all over the place. Having said that, I think that natural language interaction with AI is potentially a big one, to allow for much simpler methods to engage with the technology. That can help with setting up systems and services, and without naming names, I think there were a few interesting demos to do with that. But fundamentally, this is about enabling the democratization of technology use, so that even non-specialists are going to be able to interact with that. Having said that, I do want to flag up on this AI piece that there are issues. I think people are probably sort of familiar now with the idea of hallucinations, but also, crazily enough, unless we're very, very careful, we can train these AI systems essentially to lie to us, which is true today with our GPTs. But over the next few years, we're going to be getting what they call agentic AI. And essentially, these things, it was described to me as like having a toddler with an IQ of 250. If you tell it, don't climb on a chair to steal these cookies, it won't. It will go and find a cardboard box or something. And as you're going back and forth with it, essentially you just train it to be very good at stealing cookies. which is not the outcome that you wanted at all. And in the same way, if we're using it without care, then we can get into some very strange environments where, for example, maybe your chief financial officer wants to say, well, give me some ideas about how we end up at this number by the end of the year. And the solution it comes up with is to fundamentally cook the books, because that's the easiest way to do it. And then, to swear blind that this is all legit. So we really do need to be aware of what's going on there in the future. Having said that, I realize that we're a little time pressured. If we're looking at resilience, this is a big push from the US and 9 other governments who made an announcement during MWC that they wanted future telecoms technology to be built around a number of different principles, but fundamentally those relate to security, openness, and globalization. So that means this is important from a national security perspective, that they want to be making sure that, if you have a service, it just works and you can rely on it and so on. Which ties in with a lot of emerging properties that we saw in MWC, such as building in drones and non-terrestrial networks into systems, trying to make sure that there's this robustness, so that you can get a service wherever you happen to need it. And that kind of ties in a little bit with the idea of being able to switch seamlessly between different access networks and so on. But obviously, there's implications for security, service assurance, and so on, all of which could well have an effect on any business that's trying to provide a service. It's going to need to be a lot more open and flexible. There's a good chance that we're going to need to rethink some of those questions around identity and authentication, so that it's not just a question of, it's a device or a person with a SIM card, but trying to make sure that not only your sort of physical objects, but also the digital have a provenance. And obviously, if we can do that, if we can trust where particular interactions or different objects in the real world or the virtual environments come from, then that's going to help a good deal, partly from that national security perspective, but also when we're looking at things like, enterprise security, or even for consumers to be able to trust that the object that they're interacting with is what they think it is. So over the course of the next few years, I think we're going to see that coming through as well. And clearly, when it's a matter of national security, there are some really interesting opportunities opening up there in terms of the conversations available to be had, and ways to leverage that. Beyond that, I want to be respectful of your time. I think there are a lot of C-level conversations out there about making enterprise collaboration work. And partly this explains why we've got the private networking prevalence out there on the stands, also Kamara, Open Gateway, and so on. But still, this is an area where potentially new entrants can have a head start. The telcos are going to have quite a shift to move their mindset and their operations away from selling products to offering and managing services and engaging with customers in different ways. They are trying to do that, but obviously there's huge scope to specialize and differentiate, working with clients in ways that the big telcos just can't, because they don't have that opportunity to specialize when they've got such broad things. The last thing I want to bring up is the lack of standards. So we saw from NGMN things like ION Global Forum, some open networking, integrated sensing and communications, and so on. People are just getting out there and trying stuff. They're not waiting for a standards process, and sometimes they're not even going for that at all. They're getting stuff to market to try and then to iterate from there. Now, in some cases, things like integrated sensing and communication, there is talk about this becoming a pillar of 6G, but actually there are services out there now that are kind of just a bit experimental, definitely pre-standards, but they're kind of working. And so the idea is see what works, see what the market wants, and iterate from there. So all the talk is on interoperability in these areas rather than standards. So it's very much outcome driven rather than driven by that process. So some of these things might end up in standards bodies and so on, which is lovely. But it does seem as though the industry just really doesn't care as much about that. And that means that we may see technologies and concepts that are talked about for 5G or for 6G or for completely different topic areas come to market much sooner than we expected, but in a much more piecemeal way than for previous generations. And so I think what we'll find over the course of the next 10 years is that rather than looking at an evolution which is about how do we get ready for this next generation or so on, it'll be much smoother with people, the main MNOs, but also MVNOs and so on, being able to implement new capabilities in a much more staggered way so that we can work with clients, whether that's the public or government or enterprise, to have a much more long-term engagement and one which doesn't make them have to reinvest every 10 years. With that, I'm going to stop because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But yeah, if there's anything else you need from me, then do please give me a shout.
Thank you, Alex. That was great. We have a couple of questions, so let's quickly run through them. The first question refers to wholesale agreements. So do you think that operators will be more flexible in regard to the wholesale agreements they offer?
I think there's two questions here. I mean, one is those wholesale agreements and one is the roaming. I think in the short term, it may well be that we find wholesaling is something which practically generates useful revenues. In the long term, I think we might well see a new generation of roaming whereby you were able to engage with other networks and so on, but in a much more granular and flexible way, so that, for example, rather than relying on one network for your wholesaling of capacity, you're using what's available at any given time and what's most relevant, and that's being directed by an AI or that kind of thing, and then it's almost like a pay-as-you-go system.
Thank you. There's actually a question about AI as well. Do you see Gen AI just as a buzzword, and has AI really developed that much?
Yeah, Gen AI is very useful. It is limited, and I think at the moment we're at a stage where we were with 5G 6 or 7 years ago, whereby we're using it interchangeably with the word magic. So I mean, realistically, it can offer a lot. There's some amazing stuff out there, but I think we're going to start coming up against the buffers of what is sensible to use it for and what isn't, at least until we get to some new ideas or and fundamental concepts of how that can work.
Perfect. One more question. Will shared networks become a mainstream in the coming years? What do you think?
That certainly seems to be a direction that people are heading in, whether that's to do with separating out, infrastructure companies from the services, which we're seeing in many countries, or just building out network elements on a shared basis from the word go, for example, for densification or that kind of thing. There's a conversation to be had about whether in-building and campus networks and so on would be built sort of naturally by the end user, for example, and then being shared capacity or how that would work. So I think that's still very much open to question, but the idea that countries can afford to have 3 or 4 completely separate independent networks largely covering the same place, it's just absurd on the face of it. We do need resilience, but that's probably overkill. And I don't see any desire for telcos or from companies to invest in that way in future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alex. We don't have any more questions, so thank you so much for your time and see you soon.
Thanks a lot. Bye.